Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Brode from Deep Knowledge Investing. We work with individuals, RIAs, family offices, and billion-dollar hedge funds to help them get better returns. At Deep Knowledge Investing, one of the things we're most proud of is our incredible board of advisors. And in particular, on our board of advisors, our international policy team is particularly strong. Today, I'm excited to be joined by all three members of our board of advisors who have extensive international policy experience. In order of seniority, we have the newest member of our board of advisors, Dr. John Lenczowski. Dr. Lenczowski was President Reagan's national security advisor on the Soviet Union. He is the founder of the Institute for World Politics, and they've been a phenomenal partner to us. Welcome, John. Next up, we have Lieutenant Colonel Jason Galui, West Point graduate, combat veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, economics professor at West Point, a West Point graduate, defeated the Soviet Union in hockey, which we'll come back to later. Lieutenant Colonel retired Galui was also a special military advisor to President Obama in the Oval Office, a special economic advisor to President Trump in the Oval Office, and is the founder of For Liberty Consulting. And then we have a frequent star of our webinars, Heather Heldman, who was a member of the Obama State Department, worked at The Hague, and then started Luminae Group, an international political risk consulting firm. In her spare time, she helps U.S. intelligence agencies with hostage negotiation and rescue. She's also been our resident China expert. Welcome to all three of you. Thanks for being here. Heather, first question goes to you. We had you for a webinar in February at the beginning of the Ukraine-Russian war. At that time, everyone in the media was saying this thing is going to be over in 3 days. And then 3 days later, they were it's possible. Heather, you went on record at the time when the entire media was saying it's going to be over in days. You said months at the earliest, possibly years. You were dead right on that. What are your thoughts now for the timing?
So I think that the fighting at the level we're seeing now is likely to continue for at least another 6 months, and probably, I think, somewhere in the ballpark of 1 to 3 years. I hope, obviously, that is not true, but I see the trend line moving in that direction. At the conclusion of the sort of level of violence that we're seeing now, I do think that there will be skirmishes that will continue to go on in contested, peripheral areas for a significant period of time after that, much of the same character that happened, in the 5 years or so prior to Russia's formal invasion.
Got it. All right. You want to make a prediction on who wins, how this ends? How do we get to peace?
I think how do we get to peace is an entirely different question from how does this end. I think it's frankly going to be a material change in the political status in Russia. And this may be because the end of Putin's time arrives, or this may be because Russia encounters a significant resource constraint that it's not currently facing, that it forces it to significantly alter its strategy. But I don't think that the sort of end of the road is going to be motivated by an external factor. It's going to be very much dictated by conditions within Russia.
I think that point on an external resource loss is a crucial point. We actually had a Russian portfolio manager on one of our webinars a few months ago. He talked about that exact issue as being a potential problem. Jason, these are all economic issues, supply, resources. How do the economic incentives here shape national interests and foreign policy? We got a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Gary, for having us on. And I think to really set up a response to your question, I want to quickly jump back to 1991 and Ukraine's independence from the Soviet Union in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 91, the Kravchuk administration saw our future in Central Europe and saw Russia as its primary security threat. Within just a matter of a couple of years, by 1993, the Ukrainian government, right, thanks in large part to the heavy industrialists in eastern Ukraine, acknowledged that lack of economic cooperation with Russia, in fact, threatened Ukraine's independence and its existence. What happened in that 2-year period is the eastern Ukrainian industry, heavy industry in the eastern part of the country, couldn't effectively compete with without the energy subsidies of Russia. In that time frame, Russia offered members of the CIS, the Commonwealth of Independent States, significant lower prices relative to what it was selling on the world market. So the Ukrainians, Eastern Ukraine in particular, pressured the Kravchuk administration to maintain economic cooperation with Russia. And in fact, Ukrainian agriculture was dependent upon Russia for exports. And certainly the industrialists, as I mentioned, depended on Russia for energy resources. So there's an economic, what Ukraine was unable to do, while it wanted to look to the West and into Europe, economically it couldn't divorce itself of Russia. And in fact, as a result of this asymmetric trade, I came across an article where the Ukrainian chief of inter-republic trade at the Ministry of Economy back then said, Russia can last without Ukrainian food for a year, but Russia can halt Ukrainian industry in a day. And it just showed the power of that asymmetric trade. Fast forward, then the other thing I'll mention in response to this is Heather talked about the end of Putin's regime at some point. We can't really forget or ignore Putin's defense of his dissertation in 1996, where he writes about the mineral and raw material resources and development strategy for Russian economy. So he sees this pursuit of external resources, primarily those that are found in Ukraine, as sustaining Russian economic development.
Yeah, Jason, that's an excellent point. And the one thing that I would add to that is, in addition to Russian natural resources and fuel, they also produce a huge part of the world's fertilizer. And so by refusing to export, they can affect crop yields all over the world. It's not just Ukrainian wheat we're going to lose. It is domestic production. And I think some people are missing that. So it's a great point. John, you were part of the team that put together the strategy that beat and broke up the Soviet Union back a few decades ago in the Oval Office with President Reagan. I know you've studied not only the Soviet Union, but also President Putin in particular. What do you think he wants? Is it A, to protect the people who identify as Russian in various parts of Ukraine? Is this for him a humanitarian vision? Is it B, to keep Ukraine from becoming a NATO country because he doesn't want a hostile power on his border? Or C, is it really the megalomaniac trying to rebuild the Soviet Union from his KGB days?
It's a great question, Gary, and let me say it's a real pleasure for me to be here with you and on your advisory board. I believe that Putin is not interested particularly in protecting Russian citizens abroad. This business about Russians, and it's in the way the Russians, even before Putin, put it, when the first national security doctrine was put together of the Russian Federation in 1992, in that very first draft, that doctrine included a provision that said that Russia has the right to intervene in neighboring countries whenever the rights of its of Russian-speaking peoples are violated. This, of course, is something completely contrary to international law, but it has been part of Russian national security doctrine from the very beginning of the post-Soviet Russia. I believe that Putin has a seething resentment for the loss of superpower status. He considers, as he said publicly, that the collapse of the USSR was the greatest political catastrophe of the 20th century. And he would like to restore Russian superpower status. And this is something that generally is shared by the other people who are known as the Siloviki, the people from the power ministries, the armed forces and the intelligence services, and so on, who are basically a complete carryover from the Soviet times, and they carry over Soviet strategic culture with them. I believe that Putin is basically interested in the restoration of the former Soviet political space. He has publicly denied even that Russia has any borders, because he basically would like to restore the dynamics of the old Peter the Great Russian Empire that expanded by about the size of Switzerland every year for hundreds of years. And he'd like to cast the shadow of Russian power over Eastern and Central Europe, as happened in Soviet times, and extend into the Middle East, and so on and so forth. So it is an imperial agenda, and I believe that he is willing to pursue this no matter what the cost. And this is where there's a real question as to what will actually be the constraint that will be put on him. I believe that of the couple of options that Heather raised, the more plausible one is that there will be political pressures that could force Putin out of office one way or another, or that he will die. But I think that that's going to be the biggest issue of them all.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Heather has been talking about the possibility of internal instability in Russia for months. She was early and right on that. By the way, John, one of the things that I really love about your answer is, while so many pundits are busy playing armchair psychologist and saying, well, this is what he wants, and this is what they have no idea what's in somebody's mind. Your point is based on read what the man has written, listen to what the man has said, right? You're not engaging in any mind reading. You're saying this is somebody who has been crystal clear in public. And I think that adds some extra weight to your answer. Really solid response there. Heather, let's go back to you. I do want to give you the chance to respond to John's comment and your comment and see if you have any follow-up on that. But separately, given the fact that we are not going to go to war with Russia in any direct way, clearly we're sending the Ukrainians money, we're sending them weapons. Russia has every right to consider us a belligerent, but I don't think we're going to start sending troops against a nuclear power. What we've chosen to do have been sanctions. I have been publicly negative on the way the sanctions have been designed from the beginning. We've talked about it with the IWP, with Dr. David Glancy, which John was kind enough to help organize. We've written about it in the newspaper. But I know you've got thoughts on this, and I'd love to get some clarity from you on whether you think the sanctions are effective and what you would be doing that would be better.
Well, I think now that we have the sanctions in place, there's not a lot of sense in removing them, but there are a lot of lessons to draw from the way in which the sanctions were implemented. I do want to recognize and to some degree congratulate the Biden administration on its willingness to be bold with sanctions and to implement sanctions that were fairly unprecedented. But at the same point in time, I think that the manner in which they were rolled out was deeply strategically flawed. Because from my perspective, if you were assessing this issue in late 2021 or early 2022, as I was, you have a very clear demarcation of what success and failure were. Success was preventing an invasion. Failure was an invasion going forward. And because the invasion did indeed happen, this is the outcome that the US, the international community, and specifically, of course, Ukraine, wanted to avoid, but it did indeed come to fruition, that to me is an indication of a clear policy failure. And I think that the unwillingness to engage in other types of deterrence, not necessarily militarily, but a lot of, I think, wishful thinking, right? There's just working with allies to dispel an unhealthy amount of wishful thinking with respect to Putin. That's a critical component that was missing here. Now that you have the sanctions in place, are they all going to be effective? Are they all achieving their goals? No, and I'm not entirely sure what targeting Roman Abramovich or Putin's girlfriend is really going to achieve at the end of the day. It makes, I think, Western policymakers feel good, but if it's not yielding a change in the facts on the ground, it's not working. Now, I know that there are people who will say, well, with sanctions, you have to be patient. Okay, fine. You can leave them in place for years and you can hope that you slowly degrade Russia's economy, and that's fine. But, look around, right? It's not as if Russia has been unable to continue to sell its energy products since February 24th. It's not as if Russia is facing a universal condemnation on the international stage. He's facing condemnation on half of the international stage, and that's not sufficient from an economic perspective these days to do the type of damage to Russia's economy that would really be instrumental in bringing about policy changes. So, I think, frankly, there's a limited amount that the U.S. can do at this juncture. The U.S. can continue to support Ukraine militarily at a level that does not, sort of elicit deeper American involvement in a way that would really put American sort of lives on the line, or that does not spark a nuclear catastrophe. We can continue to work on building our own energy independence and resilience here at home. But a lot of the heavy lifting at this juncture has to be done by the Europeans and other countries that want to see a different political outcome in Ukraine, i.e., the removal of Russian forces and the establishment of a truly, independent and sovereign Ukraine, or one that has its sovereignty totally restored. You can't have it both ways. You can't continue to fuel Russia's economy with one hand and then, try to smack Putin with the other.
Heather, really strong answer. I want to come back to you with a follow-up. Jason, just so you know, there are some great questions coming in through the chat that are going to be perfect for you. So read the chat, you know what's coming. Heather, the thing I really like about your answer is we've agreed with you. The sanctions are well-meaning. The headlines are great. Our biggest concern at Deep Knowledge Investing is the sanctions have weakened the status of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. And we've pointed out the exact point you've made, which is most of the world has not joined us. Russia is still doing business with most of the world. And as a result, we're not really bringing their economy to a halt, but we are hurting the dollar. You're right that Europe is at the front lines here from an economic point of view. In particular, what should Germany do? Because the sanctions aren't working there. These guys are going to be going into the winter without fuel.
It's very tempting to use this time to cast blame on Germany's previously misguided choices, because if we look back at some of the choices that the German leadership has made over the last 10, 20, 30 years, they have not heeded lessons from their neighbors, and I think have been, fairly naive in their dealings with Putin. But that is in the past. Moving forward, I think realistically, the Germans are going to need to hustle to find alternative sources of energy to sort of get them through the winter. And I assume that they are doing that, though I have not investigated the issue thoroughly in the last 24 to 48 hours. And I think, Olaf Scholz is going to really need to prepare his citizenry to weather some difficult times. And this is a very difficult, ask for any Western political leader these days, because I think that, the populations of Europe and the United States have become, frankly, too cozy and too accustomed to getting everything on demand and for, very little cost, both in absolute and relative terms. And that is just not an expectation that may be appropriate for the geopolitical environment that's going to persist for the next probably 20 to 40 years. So that it doesn't make me happy to say that, but I think, the Germans, their best option is frankly continuing to innovate out of this solution. If you want to regain your leverage in international affairs, a huge component of that now, as it has always been, is energy independence. And the way to that in the 21st century is innovation. You want to break your reliance on traditional extractives unless you have a prime source of them, because unless you're a producer, right? Because otherwise you're always beholden to someone else. And unfortunately, the Germans are learning this in a very hard way that they've not had to confront for some time.
Heather, this is why I always love having you on our webinars. It's the absolute clarity, which is fantastic. For everybody listening in the audience, if you've got questions for any or all of our three experts up here, Merge asking anyone else believes sanctions backfired and need to be removed because it's added to our inflation problems. George, check out the Deep Knowledge Investing blog, click the research tab, go to webinars and see the one that I did with John Lenczowski's Institute for World Politics on the sanctions. We've made that exact point. Jason, you have a phenomenal background in economics. Love to get your view on the sanctions.
Sure. Well, I'll start maybe a little sanctions theory. And that sanctions tend to fail or succeed, but they tend to fail really for I think about it in two different categories: political failure of sanctions and then the economic failure of sanctions. On the political side, the short of it is the target leaders, the leaders of the countries that are targeted, the targets of sanctions, they tend to dig in on their policy position. Right, so the idea is that you impose sanctions, it hurts the economy, it hurts, and politically there's some pushback against the leadership. But what we have seen in the from the Castro regime to the Kim regime to Saddam Hussein to Assad, and perhaps now with Putin, they just dig in on their policy position, doubling down essentially, and then create the narrative that the sanctions by the evil West are hurting the people. So there's a political aspect to it, certainly. And then on the economic side, there's economic failure because the embargo or the trade block imposes little to no damage on the target. And the question then is, under what conditions would economic sanctions be more likely to succeed? And I would offer that it's when the target country has relatively inelastic demand for imports, or relatively inelastic demand supply for its exports, and then countries outside the embargo have low elasticities of that supply or demand for their imports or exports, is you're more likely to have the economic sanctions to work. Now, in the case of Russia, certainly there's inelastic supply of Russian energy. And as we continue to see, and to your point, within Deep Knowledge Investing, the number of countries that have not joined the West in either the sanctions regime against Russia or other reasons to speak out against Russia, they do not have lowest elasticity of demand for energy. Thus, they're going to want that Russian oil and gas, just like I mentioned in the 1991 to 93 period, where the heavy industrialists in Eastern Ukraine needed the Russian energy to be competitive. So the success of the sanctions depends heavily on, whether there's an alternative for the target state. And in this case, Russia has an alternative market to which to sell. And then another point on the erosion of the power of the dollar. In my last job in government at the Council of Economic Advisors, we did work around sanctions and the effects that sanctions have on the ability of the United States to use them. One reason why sanctions, we think about sanctions as being even a reasonable economic option, is because of the strength of the dollar and the fact that the dollar is the reserve currency, and majority of international transactions are settled in the dollar. But the more we use sanctions and we extend the long arm of jurisdiction, as some might call it, there's an equal and opposite reaction, and we tend to hear potential adversaries, and in some cases allies and partners, talk about maybe moving away from the dollar because of that long arm jurisdiction. So every time we use sanctions, we're simultaneously eroding the power of the dollar, the magnitude of which is tough to assess. But I think a recent memory of sanctions regime being more effective than not, I think, is on the 2015 Iran sanctions. I think the piece there was that we had just a large multilateral, a large group of countries really putting the sanctions on Iran. We were relatively sudden and extreme, and it worked to some degree. On George's question, I saw about adding to inflation problems, and should the sanctions be removed because they've added to our inflation problems? I think that I would say to George, it depends. It depends on our willingness as a country to pay for the objective we seek in Russia, which I think, as we've mentioned here, is ideally we'd love to see the Russian forces out of Ukraine. And if that means we impose maybe strict, more serious sanctions that drive up prices of energy a little bit more, that's a question, that's a discussion, a trade-off discussion that we need to have nationally, that I'm not sure right now we can have that conversation in an honest fashion nationally.
Yeah, Jason, you're entirely right. People are not talking about trade-offs, and the press and the White House are presenting these sanctions as if they're one-sided. And I've been writing in the newspaper for months. There is a hidden cost to the American people, and maybe the American people are willing to pay it, maybe not, but people should be informed. We should know what it's costing us. John, I want to go to you with this great question from Alan from Denmark. He has two questions here. One, if we see the Republicans win during the midterms, will it have impact on the level of economic support to Ukraine? Second, his thesis is that a new president in the White House might be necessary before we see serious peace negotiations. What's your take on that? So, two questions to you.
I think that first of all, the problem here is that the United States does not have a coherent strategy. That's the fundamental larger problem. And so when you talk about sanctions, for example, what does success mean? There are multiple purposes for sanctions. In the case of our sanctions against Cuba, they might have had an initial objective of trying to put such pressure on the communist regime there that it would bring about regime change. But as they proceeded over the years, the larger purpose of them was to anathematize Cuba, to say that you are not worthy of us doing business with you. And it was in many respects a kind of a moral political statement. A Republican Congress, I think, could indeed help build a little bit of a stronger posture in terms of, let's say, greater moral and material support for Ukraine. But again, it gets back down to the question of strategy, and this administration has not developed one. One of the closest statements for what our goals are, which a strategy would be designed to achieve, came from Secretary of Defense Austin, who said our goal is to weaken Russia. In my view, The goal here has to be to stop Russian imperialism, and it is, and Ukraine isn't the only country that is the target here. Putin came out publicly and said that Kazakhstan has never really been a country before, and he basically assumes that Kazakhstan is part of Greater Russia, and we could say this about other countries, the Baltic states, Moldova, etc. Our goal has to be to stop Russian imperialism. And I don't think that that's going to happen until there is a tremendous amount of political pressure on Putin. And sanctions, intelligently conceived, may be part of that formula. But ultimately, if there isn't a psychological strategy, if there isn't a political warfare strategy that is designed to turn the people against this regime, I don't think anything is going to succeed here. The Russian army, Yuri Yermagayev, a great dissident during the Cold War, a scientist who just wrote a magnificent article in the Washington Times about how we need to target the Russian army with a psychological campaign to demoralize it. It's an essential part of such a strategy. But we also have to break, in my view, the center of gravity in this entire conflict, especially insofar as there is a new de facto Cold War between us and Russia. The center of gravity in that Cold War is Russia's monopoly of communications and information and their ability to propagandize their own people into believing complete historical revisionism, a false narrative, and all sorts of lies about Ukraine. And Putin and his propaganda apparatus have succeeded in influencing the minds of millions of Russians who will not even believe their own relatives who call them from Ukraine and testify to the war crimes that they personally are witnessing, and who are denying the existence of Nazism as any kind of a significant force in Ukraine. And so there needs to be an integrated strategy here with a coherent set of goals, and all of that is missing in this administration for all of the positive steps that it may have taken.
You know, John, one of the things you were just talking about, the way that Putin is able to use the media to lie to his own people. I've also heard you make the same point that Putin has used our media to lie to our people. And that's certainly been a point you've made in a very strong way in the past. So I actually think the point you're making can be amplified even further. Heather, I want to go to you. 2 questions. One, I want to get your response to John's comments, but 2, there's a phenomenal question in the chat coming from Larry, and I know this is right up your power alley. Larry wants to know, how can sanctions work when China and their allies are providing other options? And he's building on the point that we were talking about before, which is we do not have, unanimous agreement from the world, and China is a pretty big market to be doing business with Russia. I like Larry's question here. So you got 2 questions in front of you. Fire away, whatever way you want.
So the first point that I'd like to make is that I wholeheartedly agree with John's sentiments about the lack of U.S. strategy. I think that this is, frankly, the number one overarching problem and challenge with U.S. foreign policy today, and that if the conflict in Ukraine is providing a microcosm through which we can see the ramifications of a lack of long-term thinking and lack of cohesive strategy with clear goals. But it's not an isolated incident. And I think that, frankly, this is a bipartisan issue. It extends beyond the Biden administration, though this administration is certainly, sort of shining a spotlight on the issue. I think it points to deeper problems in the way in which foreign policy decision making takes place and is communicated not just internally in, throughout the interagency or the broader sort of policy making apparatus in Washington, but also the dialogue that Washington is having with the American people. And we all need to get on the same page in a much more cohesive fashion. Otherwise, this pattern of lurching from crisis to crisis and really going into a conflict management mode rather than to a place of conflict resolution, this is going to plague us for decades. And frankly, it's not something, I think as the youngest member of this panel that I want to live the rest of my life dealing with. So I think we need to sort of use this moment to make a clarion call for much better strategic thinking, and strategic thinking that transcends partisan lines and that really goes back to the core of U.S. national security interests. So that's point one. And so thank you, John, for raising that issue. On the issue of China and what are our options as long as the Chinese and other, well, I'll call them non-compliant economies, continue to do significant business with Russia. Frankly, I don't think we have a lot of options. I think that this is a reality that we're going to need to settle in and adjust to for quite some time. And what it highlights is that if you want to use sanctions, by all means, go for it. It may not be the policy tool that I would draw upon first if I were sitting in the Oval Office, but I don't pretend to have the ability to dictate to this administration what to do. If you're going to use sanctions, you have to use them in a very limited way that is sufficiently narrow that you can get a meaningful amount of international cooperation. Because if that doesn't happen, it is a measure that's going to make the domestic audience feel good. Biden can go to his base, or another president could go to his or her base and say, look, I impose sanctions, clap for me. But it's not going to move the needle. And I think this is also, really what we're seeing with Iran. There are a lot of sanctions evaders, and they all have their own, rational reasons for engaging in the behavior that they do. So you can call it a crisis of communication. You haven't been an effective salesman or sufficiently effective salesman when it comes to marketing these around the world as a tool that's really going to bring about positive change for all parties involved. But I think really it's just recognizing, frankly, that sanctions can be very effective, but they have to be very targeted. And I think we also need to recognize that in 2022, imposing sanctions comes with a level of complexity that didn't exist before cryptocurrency existed, that didn't exist before all the other forms of electronic banking existed. So as we continue to live in a world of increasingly complex financial systems, the imposition of sanctions and the maintenance of sanctions is going to continue to become increasingly difficult. And this is probably just an opportunity to really sit back and think about whether it makes sense to have this tool be such a prominent one in our arsenal.
Got it. All right. Jason, there's a great question from George in the chat. He wants to know, how is it a bipartisan issue when the Democrats control all levels of the legislative branch? I know you want to respond to the issues on strategic thinking and bipartisan comments. Love to get your point of view on this.
Okay, thanks, Gary. Thanks, George, for the question. My brain's racing quite fast, trying to figure out where to start the conversation. So I'll start with the idea. I think most everyone would agree that to have an effective strategy, you need a shared goal. And we've talked on here how hard that has been. The Biden administration, we are suggesting, does not have a coherent strategy, thus a shared or a clear goal with respect to Russia, maybe with respect to the China-Taiwan issue. But I think to achieve clarity in strategic thinking, to avoid strategic confusion, it requires an ability to have honest dialogue on what I would say is Team America. And right now, I don't know if Team America is solid enough to have a real strategic thinking dialogue. And if you just think in our government, between the executive branch and the legislative branch, having that conversation, it is a challenge. We have, just on the foreign policy side, of course, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who could call folks to the Hill, folks like Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin and others, and have them articulate the strategy for the American people. But our domestic politics gets in the way of that and prevents real conversations from happening. And to the question someone had earlier about if the Republicans were to take back control of the House in the midterms, one thing I think about is I think of Representative Michael McCall quite often. He's a Republican congressman who represents the district here in Texas that stretches from Austin to Houston. He likely would be the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And I've had this conversation with him about having a strategic dialogue with folks in the executive branch. One of, a potential concern that he has, and it certainly I have, is these, the people making policy, advising on policy, are just people, right? People like Heather and me and John, and we have limited bandwidth. If the House Foreign Affairs Committee next year is inundated with the need to investigate the Biden administration, the opportunity cost to America is not getting strategic thinking. And so we, my greatest fear for our country is not Russia and Ukraine. It's not China, Taiwan. It's what I would characterize our loss of national honesty. We have to be able to talk honestly here so that we can have coherent strategies globally. And having been in the Obama White House and the Trump White House, I often find myself just wanting to yell at the top of my lungs to somehow say we have real enemies beyond our borders. And to get to John's point of achieving strategic thinking requires dropping the R&D after one's name and put be an American and put our objectives first. How we get there, we might debate upon, but we do need the shared goals and an ability to articulate that in an honest fashion. So I'll leave it there, Gary. But that's where my brain has been recently as I look at the international world. Is our domestically we are in a state where I don't know if we can achieve a strategic, a coherent international strategic goals that we want to do so for our children.
Yeah, Jason, your comment there mirrors the guest post you put up on the Deep Knowledge Investing blog last week regarding Speaker Pelosi's trip to Taiwan, and that there could be many reasons she'd be doing it, from national interest to partisan interest to personal interest, and we simply don't know. Jason, I want to stay with you from another question from the chat, because George gets to a point that I actually wanted to ask you about. George is concerned about the United States looking weak in the eyes of China and how we applied the sanctions, and how China is working to mitigate sanctions, or how they would mitigate sanctions if they were applied by the U.S. If they attack Taiwan. I think that's an interesting question. My follow-up for you is, given your combat experience, and by the way, thank you for your service, what happens if China attacks Taiwan? Do you think the United States and Taiwan can defend the island against the Chinese military? And how do we help Taiwan defend against a nuclear power?
So in the remaining time that we have to solve China-Taiwan, I will start with time. The time horizon matters. Right? The Chinese time horizon is much longer than our time horizon. They are willing to wait. Maybe I should restate that slightly. President Xi is willing to wait as long as he possibly can to be able to bring about their reunification. China is much more patient than we are. I think President Xi has been clear, just as we said about President Putin. Read their words, take what they say at relative face value. And as someone who's been in the room for phone calls between heads of state, what they say publicly and privately is pretty much the same. And President Xi has stated that by 2049, 2050, right around the 100-year anniversary of the Communist Party in China, that he wants to have built a community of common destiny for all mankind and develop a system that is socialist with Chinese characteristics. They have an imperial sense, just like Russia does. I'll finish it. I'll talk about economic side and then jump to the military side quickly. I think a difference between Taiwan and Ukraine, as I mentioned earlier, Ukraine was unable to divorce itself economically from Russia in ways that I think Taiwan has been able to do so. Taiwan is an economic powerhouse. It has a strong comparative advantage in the global design and manufacturing of semiconductors. We saw the big recent news of the chips bill being passed and signed into law. From a military perspective, I think first back to timing, China really has two windows of attack into China and into Taiwan, given seasonal weather patterns. We can't remember, you can't just invade without the weather being conducive to such an advantage. And it's really given the monsoon seasons that exist in that part of the world. I think it's really they really have May to July and the month of October as the two windows. So we're in August, so we're into monsoon season, the August-September monsoon season in that region. So October is the next likely window of when an attack would be more likely to be successful. Not saying that we couldn't be surprised. I think a Chinese invasion of Taiwan would begin long before the military forces attack. In U.S. military planning, we talk about the 6 phases of operations. Phase 0 is shaping the operations, and phase 1 is to deter. Phase 2 is to seize the initiative. I think China, again, back to their long time horizon, has already started their invasion of Taiwan, much like Russia started invading Ukraine long before the forces in 2014 annexed Crimea. And it goes back to, again, 1991 to 93, where they were able to shape, Russia was able to shape inside Ukraine the domestic political conversation. Likewise, in Taiwan, if China is able to increase the number of residents in Taiwan who lean favorably towards the mainland, they can begin to change the domestic conversation in Taiwan, move the needle, if you will, towards the one China policy, the Chinese version of it. Then that's shaping the environment, and then the military could act. But I think that China would prefer not to take it by force because of the significant cost. The question you asked, whether or not the United States would be willing to defend Taiwan, that question has been debated oftentimes. We have the Taiwan Relations Act. We're ambiguous about our response to Taiwan. If you forced me to answer the question, if you held the gun to my head and told me I had to answer one the way or the other, I think the United States would, because it would. If we didn't, it would, I think, significantly erode the credibility of all of our alliances and agreements, and that is the center. Those alliances, those relationships, are the centerpiece of a lot of our global strategies. The last point on the sanctions. Sorry, the last question on the sanctions. The last point is the playbook, if you will, that we use on sanctions against Russia in response to their invasion of Ukraine. We would not be able to rely on that same playbook, because I think our businesses, U.S. businesses, are more intertwined with China than U.S. businesses were with Russia. It was very easy for companies to say, "Oh, we're leaving Russia." They won't be able to do that as effectively or as quickly in China. So I think the U.S. business community's ability to absorb the secondary effects of sanctions would hinder any sanctions regime that we would seek to place onto China in any incursion or aggression towards Taiwan, and China knows that as well as we do, if not better.
Jason, I actually want to go to John in just a second because he's done so much work on China. I want to get his perspective on this. Before we do that, and before we run out of time, from a military point of view, let's imagine that China does decide to invade in the next 2 years. And let's further hypothesize that the United States follows the course of action that you think it might. Sounds like a 51-49 call, but the U.S. might help defend. Does the United States military have the capacity to defend Taiwan, especially given everything I've read about China's hypersonic missiles that supposedly can sink an aircraft carrier? How do we do that on that side of the world? Or can we?
So on this webinar for Deep Knowledge Investing, I would answer in the affirmative that the United States military does have the capacity to defend Taiwan and would be able to increase that capacity in relatively short order. One thing that the United States is historically very good at, while we may suffer from strategic confusion before the events kick off, when events kick off, we tend to harness our ability to innovate and react and respond with Team America. So I think we would, and I think China does also recognize that. So within the next 2 years, I still think the United States has, and Taiwan has, the significant qualitative military edge over China. Quantitatively, China, they're just bigger. They'll have more numbers. But qualitatively, in our response, I think would win the day militarily. And again, I think China knows that, which is why they want to absorb Taiwan over time. The longer they can stretch the game out, the better for them.
Wow, Jason, like everyone else here, incredible clarity. That's phenomenal. John, I want to come back to you. You have spoken publicly and at length about trying to contain China and their goals. Jason, during this webinar, has talked about China taking a long-term view on everything. Heather has commented on that in past webinars. She's written on it. If you were back in the Oval Office advising, what would you be doing now? What are our options?
I believe that the number one instrument of our national power, as can be exercised by the President of the United States, is the telling of the truth to the American people. The truth is the most powerful weapon of all. When the American people have the facts, there are a lot of goofy people in our country, but the vast majority of Americans have what one can call common sense. And we can come to a good national consensus of what ought to be done. Now, sometimes there can be such a thing as war fever. I saw, for example, the war fever during the build-up to the Iraq War, and there was barely anybody could speak out against it. I happened to be a huge skeptic of this, but I was not in the public square. I had another job to do. I was not crusading about that issue, but I thought it was a grave strategic error by the Bush administration, and I think that that's when somehow we lost a lot of our national common sense. But I don't think all the truth was being told then. And I think when it is told, it can make a huge difference. One of the biggest problems we have faced, and this is a problem that Jason has mentioned in how China has had its strategy towards Taiwan, and that is it has wanted to soften up public opinion. It has wanted to own people in Taiwan so that they will go along with the Chinese agenda. China has done an incredible job of acquiring ownership of all sorts of Americans at many different levels. We have this incredibly unseemly spectacle of former secretaries of state, defense, intelligence agency directors working for consulting firms that open doors in Beijing for American corporations. They are effectively, indirectly on Beijing's payroll. They have never anything to say about any threat from China. They'll talk about every other threat in the world, but they won't talk about a threat from their paymaster. We see universities addicted to Chinese money. We see something like 7 or 8 of the most blue chip think tanks in Washington who have been taking money from front organizations of Chinese intelligence, have done joint projects with front organizations of Chinese intelligence. We see incredible Chinese influence over Hollywood. We see Chinese influence over our major media, with the Washington Post and the New York Times having taken millions of dollars from Chinese propaganda ministries to publish Chinese communist propaganda. And then they withhold information in their newspapers about strategic developments that China is engaging in that are inimical to the national security of this country. China has been working on softening up the United States in a very big way. And frankly, the COVID origins in Wuhan and the Chinese cover-up of the origins of this pandemic gave us an amazing, almost providential wake-up call to the malign purposes that China has strategically towards the United States. And I think that there's been a remarkable bipartisan consensus that we are enjoying concerning what China's role is in the world today. China, let me just say also, the Russian attempt to soften up Ukraine started many, many years before. In 1994, the Ukrainians were complaining publicly about Russian active measures, about their subversion of Ukrainian politics. And in my view, 20 years of that subversion was going on before they invaded the eastern provinces and Crimea. I think that we need, as a nation, to confront all of the facts about the Chinese strategic threat to the United States and to the region. And I think we need to take appropriate action. We need to build up our armed forces in ways that we're not doing today. We need to become much less dependent upon Chinese supply chains. China could checkmate us in a couple of weeks just on the basis of embargoing pharmaceuticals to Americans. We need to.
That's a point I've made on an IWP webinar. They control 90% of our pharmaceutical supply. They can kill grandma in weeks. It is a huge problem.
It's a catastrophe. We used to make these things in Puerto Rico by giving the pharmaceutical industry tax benefits. That needs to be restored. Let's bring it back to Puerto Rico and start making our pharmaceuticals in the United States.
Yeah, John, these are
more that can be said.
No, these are key points that I've discussed with your people on your platform. John and Jason, stick with me for a minute because we've got a couple more great questions in the chat. I know Heather is short on time. Heather Heldman, managing partner of Luminae Group, formerly the State Department, and the Hague member of the Deep Knowledge Investing Board of Advisors. Thank you so much. For people who are interested in your perspective, and everyone who's listening, you should be interested in Heather's geopolitical perspective. How can people find you? How can they find your writing? How can they learn more about Luminae Group?
So thanks so much for having me today, Gary. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to all of you, and to John and Jason. It's been an honor to be on a webinar with both of you. I would encourage all active and interested listeners to check out Luminae Group's website, LUMINAE group.com. You'll find all types of contact information there, as well as information about my firm and what we do. And I would be happy to have a follow-up conversation with any of your attendees. Thank you again, Gary.
Gotcha. All right. And I've got luminagroup.com up in the chat for people who want to see it. It's Heather Heldman. I know you need to sign off. Heather, thank you so much for being here. Love getting your perspective.
Can you just, one more point, Gary, the spelling in the chat is off.
Oh, I did. All right. Can you put it up in the chat? Sorry. Oh,
Sure.
You're right. I typed it wrong. I was trying to type quickly.
Thank you all.
Yeah, it's Lumina and not Luna. Nah. There we go. All right, everyone, use Heather's version, not mine. Heather, have a great meeting at 1 o'clock. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, Heather. John and Jason, thanks for sticking with me. We got a question from Howard, another member of the Deep Knowledge Investing Board of Advisors. He loves following your work. He wants to know if there are any players in Europe that were concerned about taking steps in front of us that could make things worse, or are most European leaders in step with us? I'm going to supplement Howard's question with a one-word additional question. That would be Turkey. And you could say Turkey's sort of part of Europe, but they're part of NATO, so I'm including it in Howard's question. Jason, you were nodding first. We'll go to you. John, you can respond afterwards.
I mean, certainly that is the first country that came to my mind was Turkey, and specifically President Erdogan. Who is certainly as a NATO member makes all things NATO a bit more challenging, just as he did with Sweden and Finland's recent desire and accession into NATO. So that certainly makes it challenging. It will be telling as we move closer to the winter months, the fact that the inelasticity of demand for Russian energy, which European countries blink first, and so I certainly don't know where all the European leaders stand, but I think if our governments, if our executive branch is doing their job, then we are making the choice clear that the U.S. should be the choice. Or as some might say, the U.S. will be on the right side of history. The Russians won't. So encourage European leaders to be there. But European leaders also, folks like Erdogan, realist in nature, and will continue to balance both U.S. and Russia, partly out of necessity for where they sit geographically. So I'll hold there and turn it over to John.
All right, John, we're going to give you the last word before we wrap up here. Go ahead.
Well, I have an abiding concern about Germany. I think that Germany has had a very, very long history of wanting to have some kind of condominium with Russia in order to maintain a kind of a cooperative hegemony over the lands in between them. And this is, there's a geostrategic logic to this, which I think transcends whoever happens to be in power in Germany. However, Germany is part of the West, for goodness sake. And but so many people in Germany have been influenced by Russia. The Russian intelligence services have been involved in influencing in the environmental movement in Germany. They have given covert support, different kinds of support to the environmental movement in order to encourage Germany to abandon any kind of a capacity of domestic energy production in fossil fuels, such as hydraulic fracturing and to extract those natural gas resources, that some of which it does have. But it is abjured doing those things, partly under Russian covert influence. And I think that this is a situation where the German people need to be better informed about the geostrategic situation. Again, the truth is the most powerful weapon here. And a large part of this involves ramping up American capacity to conduct public diplomacy. And that means everything from exchanges, visitors programs, information programs, broadcasting, the many, many ways that we can have relations with the people and not simply the government. And we have abandoned those capabilities as a government, and they have been missing from our quiver of weapons of the different arts of statecraft, and this is a major reform needs to be done along these lines. I think that there is hope for good relations with our various European partners, but I think the truth has to prevail here.
All right, John, you've got the last word on that. Thank you for your clarity, for your perspective. Speaking of statecraft, I know your passion right now is helping young people prepare for better careers in statecraft at the Institute for World Politics. For people who are interested in your point of view and what you're doing at the IWP, how can they find you?
Our website is iwp.edu. iwp.edu. And we have 7 master's degree programs. We have the nation's first professional doctoral program in national security. We have the first master's degree in strategic intelligence outside of the U.S. government. And about half our students are recent college grads, and the other half are mid-career professionals from every imaginable organization, whether it's government agencies, government contractors, various different private sector organizations. And our goal is to teach the different arts of statecraft, the instruments of national power, how they are integrated in national strategy. And integrated strategic thinking is one of the hardest things to do, because every one of the different agencies involved in our foreign policy has its own inbred strategic and bureaucratic culture, and it's very difficult for people to comprehend the fact that they're part of an orchestra. They aren't simply their own instrument, and they have to work as a team in whole of government approaches.
All right, fantastic. And Jason, unbelievable background at West Point, combat veteran, 2-time Oval Office advisor, and now the founder of For Liberty Consulting. A lot of strong, clear points today for people who are interested in knowing more about you. And actually, before you get a chance to talk about yourself, I just want to mention to everyone, Jason knows more about leadership than anyone I know. If you're running an organization and you need leadership consulting, leadership coaching, he would be the person to talk to. Jason, for people who want to find you, where do they go?
So in the chat, I just put in forlibertyconsulting.com. Also, I lead the SMU Center, Southern Methodist University Center for Commercial and Corporate Diplomacy, where we help government officials and business leaders better understand one another. And then at Texas A&M, I lead the Eisenhower Working Group on Economic Statecraft. So those 3 locations, forlibertyconsulting.com, SMU Commercial Diplomacy Initiative, and the Eisenhower Working Group at Texas A&M are places to find me and what we are up to.
All right, terrific. Lenczowski, managing partner, Heather Heldman of Luminae Group. All 3 of you are phenomenal. We're very fortunate to have you on the board of advisors. And for everyone who's still listening, I want to let you know that there's a reason I wanted all 3 of these people from the DKI board on screen at the same time. We're making a point. The situation that we're facing right now in Russia, Ukraine, and potentially with China and Taiwan is the biggest international political event since 9/11. It is affecting the markets. And we believe here at Deep Knowledge Investing, we are better equipped to help you understand these events than anyone else in finance. I think if any of the big Wall Street firms had any of these 3 people for a webinar, they'd be featuring them by putting all 3 on the screen at the same time. We're making a point about our capabilities at a firm to bring you, as a firm, to bring you the best analysis available in terms of how to understand the markets. I'm Gary Brode from Deep Knowledge Investing, and Jason, John, and Heather, who had to hop off, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Gary.
Thanks, Gary.
All right. Take care, everyone. Have a great day.